Even in an AI-focused world, MacroEdge is in the business of focusing on you. We don't just understand our clients, we listen to what's said and illuminate on what's not. In a world moving at the speed of light, with shifting markets, evolving workforces, and non-stop disruption, MacroEdge helps you to navigate and identify novel opportunities, expand your enterprise, and succeed in tomorrow's world. And it all starts with you. Put your enterprise and your perspective in the driver's seat. We're in the business of you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to MacroEdge Radio number 54. This is John Galt speaking. This is going to be a fantastic show with limited commercial interruptions. We want to keep this tight for our guest. If you have any questions, please submit them in the chat room. Craig Fuller of FreightWaves is become a legend, in my opinion, because he's taken the archaic old way of publishing data and enhancing the information available to transportation and logistics professionals and taking it out of the dry, crusty papers like, I don't know, Transport Topics, for example, and brought it into the modern era. And we're going to talk about logistics, the tariffs and trade war, trucking, containers, and everything else, including my favorite subject outside of that, his magazine empire, where this man has saved Flying Magazine, one of my childhood favorites. Without further ado, Craig, welcome to MacroEdge Radio.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Can you guys hear me okay?
You sound perfect, sir. 5 over 5. 5 over 5. I appreciate you coming on board. I've just got one thing to start before we go into the logistics and transportation. Would you do me a favor and buy Air Classics? It's on my list. That's all.
Dude, I love that. There's so many great legacy magazines that are out there that are just waiting to be discovered and bought and reimagined. So it is certainly on our list.
Thank you, sir. And you've done a fantastic job with Flying Magazine. But before we sit there and talk about Fire Crown and everything under that umbrella, let me just get your initial impressions on the current state of trucking and transportation, be it from the smaller carriers to the mega carriers. We've seen J.B. Hunt report this week, and once again, they've demonstrated they have a firm grip and understanding on the dedicated and intermodal aspects of the transportation industry and made the moves a decade ago to revolutionize that. But then you see Martin report with a 107 on their intermodal, and I'm looking at that OR going, how do you operate that poorly with intermodal when most of your expenses are taken care of? So it tells me that not all of the big carriers have their act together, and you see it when you start reading the quarterly reports. Give us your impressions, please.
Well, I think J.B. Hunt is an exception to the rule because for folks that are in the sort of inside baseball, it may not be as well known to the broader public, is that J.B. Hunt actually doesn't have a fixed cost structure with the railroads. It has a floating cost structure. So it gives them a lot of edge to basically, the way it works is that J.B. Hunt sets the prices for their clients and effectively the railroad gets a percentage of whatever that is. And they had most favoredation pricing with the railroads. They're the only ones that have it. In fact, you can go look at the history of this, is that I believe it's BNSF and J.B. Hunt have historically gotten into legal battles. It sort of reminds me of, rarely do you see a supplier sue its vendors and vendors sue its customers and all this stuff. But this is exactly what happens. It reminds me of the Samsung Apple lawsuits that happened in tech, where these codependent partnerships, and J.B. Hunt is codependent with the railroads as they are with them, have ended up suing each other because of some contract dispute. They can't afford to walk away. Neither party would be able to benefit from that, but they do end up suing each other for interpretations of what the agreements are supposed to say. And this is sort of a unique case for J.B. Hunt. It's also why J.B. Hunt's revenue or its operating performance on intermodal is so consistent, is because of the fact that it has this sort of variable structure that none of the other truckers enjoy.
I understand that because when I was involved with intermodal, it was all an experiment in our time. We didn't even have the correct equipment for that, but we made it work. And CSX was a great partner because they were trying to expand into the field. But I'm talking early 90s versus this current era. the revolution that's occurred since my generation of trucking is amazing. And I think that companies like C.H. Robinson, J.B. Hunt, Uber Freight to some degree, Amazon, et cetera, they're using more technological advances to keep costs down versus some of the old legacy carriers who are trying to just modernize what they have as an existing structure instead of restructuring and becoming more efficient. Maybe that's just me on the outside looking in, but I'd like your take on that.
Yeah, no, I think what we've seen is it's interesting because, St. Robin specifically was sort of the only major freight broker of scale for many years. And it had sort of an unfair advantage, if you will, in the sense that it had such a giant scale and sort of was the backdrop. I remember this was probably 5 years ago. I was visiting with Shelley Simpson, now the CEO of JB Hunt. She commented in that meeting that no matter what account they go into or who they call on, C.H. Robinson's there. And I think C.H. Robinson's business model is such that they, for many years, they were sort of an uncontested player in the logistics and brokerage industry. And that, the competitive edge has gone away. It's been eroded by a lot of competition. And I think C.H. Robinson has done, I think smartly so, is that they've invested a lot in their technology, like with Navisphere, and have built out a much more robust set of offerings that are sort of tech-driven than they are human-driven. For many years, C.H. Robinson's business model was largely human capital-driven and largely incentives to their folks, and they're paying out substantial commissions to the freight brokers. And the problem with that is that all you have is your commission structure and your human capital. It also means that human capital can walk. And I think C.H. Robinson has experienced that. Is they have trained so many freight brokers in our industry to go, after a couple of years, to go out and do their own thing. And it's been something that there's a very large alumni network of former Robinson folks that are in the industry, and many of them some of the best people in the industry. But it also creates problems when the industry is mature enough where anybody can take a book of business. You work at Robinson for a year and you essentially go start your own freight broker. That has created a lot of problems. So they've had to readapt their business model. We're starting to see that. And look, freight brokerage compared to, you're talking about the 90s. So you're dating, both. I was in trucking, been in it my whole life, but certainly in the 90s, the railroads were, these were businesses that were somewhat of a mess. They started to really compete with truckers on intermodal in the 90s. Really credit to JB Hunt. You could say Schneider's in that group, Hub Group's in that group, Pacer, if I'm sort of dating myself. They were very successful intermodal operators, but it was still a very small piece of the business. Today, intermodal plays a primary role in shipper routing guides, which has enabled them to effectively take a lot of share from truckers. And the other part of the trucking industry, which we've seen massive erosion in market share, is because the brokers now play a primary role. And for many years, the brokers were sort of a cottage industry, and C.H. Robinson sort of had that industry, I wouldn't say all to itself, but played a large role as a backhaul business. And now it plays a primary role in the routing guide. And so that's really made it difficult for companies like Martin, companies, Heartland has been in some of a disaster in recent quarters, even Werner. Heartland and Werner were sort of the most consistent operators, and they've really been challenged as this industry has fought with new market share competition between intermodal and brokerage.
110% agree. Heartland and Werner have just deteriorated to levels I didn't think were possible. And I think it's a failure to recognize, to understand the change in the marketplace as you've highlighted, nor to modernize at the proper time. At some point, you have to invest some capital in the technology to make things more efficient. And I'll date myself again. Our company was one of the beta testers for Qualcomm. And when that came out, it was a revolution to the industry, as you know. When you start looking at what has happened since that era began, if you didn't adapt to the new, more efficient technology, your people became less efficient. And that took away time that you could dedicate to customers, smoothing them over and providing more in-person customer service. It's become a rather impersonal business in some ways. What do you think the impacts of the Uber Freights and Amazon brokerages is going to have on the mega brokers like C.H. Robinson and some of the brokerage operations for the large trucking companies?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Uber Freight, you could even put, former rest in peace Convoy in that sort of case, Transfix, which is now part of NFI, LoadSmart, et cetera. These digital platforms, they were never really what they were sort of supposed to be, right? They were supposed to be these revolutionary pieces of technology that was supposed to create marketplaces, and the profitabilities would come through technology versus human capital. And what those businesses realized pretty quickly, I don't know that their investors realized it as quick as I think the business leaders did, is they needed humans. And in fact, if you walked into a brokerage floor at Convoy, or before Uber Freight bought Transplace, you could even see it at Uber, they operated a lot like traditional freight brokers. They were hiring freight brokers. They were incenting like freight brokerage. And they were building out layers of technology. Perhaps they had more advanced technology than the incumbents, but there was very little difference between, say, Uber Freight's business model and C.H. Robinson's business model. Effectively, they were buying and selling capacity through some sort of technology. Maybe Uber Freight, in fairness, is a little bit more tech-driven, but at the end of the day, the business model delta was pretty thin. And I think what happened at the same time is that venture capitalists discovered logistics in 2015 and poured billions upon billions of dollars in a lot of these SaaS and application businesses that were able to take an incumbent like a C.H. Robinson, but maybe a very small company, and in brokerage, and sell that technology to those freight brokers, which made them in some ways more advanced than some of the legacy folks, including Robinson. Some of the stuff that you could buy off the shelf on a SaaS contract basis, either on a per seat basis or on a fixed contract that may cost $40,000 to $50,000, in some cases was better than the technology that C.H. Robinson had spent hundreds of millions of dollars building. And I think what we've seen is these upstarts in technology, these freight tech companies have been able to buy a lot of the technology off the shelf. And I think that's where the big miscalculation was in in Silicon Valley, is that the idea of buying freight from the market was not an Uber style play. When Uber, and I'm talking the consumer application style of Uber, when Uber entered the market, it created a lot of new supplemental capacity in the taxi market, or the personal transportation market, how you define that. Like my car that's sitting in a garage, now I have the opportunity to utilize that vehicle to come into the market. They eliminated the friction, but more importantly, they created a lot of incremental capacity that created an environment that allowed Uber and perhaps Lyft to a lesser extent capture a lot of share, because this capacity was sort of owned by these parties. That doesn't work in freight, and it doesn't work in trucking. And that's why a lot of the Silicon Valley players just got it wrong. But what we have seen is a lot of the new technology investments have really leveled up and allowed the smaller upstart companies to compete, and in fact, perhaps more successfully compete than a lot of the incumbents. And there's been no single group of businesses that have been more detrimentally impacted than the large asset enterprise truckload carriers of the ilk of like Heartland and CFI, and you could even argue Covenant when it was the over-the-road business. US Express, my father's business, was negatively impacted. And so that is all because of the advent of these technologies that have been sold into these businesses.
Totally understandable. I mean, in the 90s, I had a brief stint partnering up with some people in the brokerage industry, and they asked me to come in there and sell. Now, granted, you and I understand the concept of pressing the flesh to go out and make the deal. I did not seek out the giant customers that a C.H. Robinson would seek. I went out and I found the niche customers and turned a really nice profit for that brokerage by developing a loyalty, serving as a logistics department for those small companies that didn't have the time or energy to invest in that at that time. It was a very good move. Now, I think you're right. If the technology is there and someone wants to look and access carriers in that manner, it's great for the small companies. But like you've said in the past and written about in FreightWaves, the big companies are going to beat you down and take advantage of it, which brings us to the dedicated concept. We're seeing these large corporations moving more and more to dedicated fleet contracts with individual carriers. From my perspective, that's a smart move because of some of the risk we've seen with brokerage theft, which you've written about extensively in FreightWaves. Do you see that as a growing part of the model, maybe moving to an 80-20 model or even a 90-10 model with some of these corporations? Because Walmart, Kroger's, Procter and Gamble. You can go through the whole list. I've dealt with a lot of these companies. When you see that aspect of it, they have the potential to dictate and take a large chunk of the freight market away from the open market, leaving the small and mid-sized carriers in the dust.
Yeah, I mean, this trend's been going on, say, 30 years now, and really sort of in the last 2 decades. I think the over-the-road for-hire companies like a Werner, a Hunt, even when U.S. Express was operating as an independent entity, it was a large piece of the business. And you saw that more than, in many of these companies, more than half the revenue came from dedicated truck operations. It's a huge benefit to a shipper because they get confirmed dedicated capacity without the sort of and predictable cost that they would enjoy with a private fleet without the sort of risks associated with a private fleet. So they have operational expertise. They have the ability for the carriers to hire the drivers to sort of manage it on their behalf. And they don't have to deal with the potential liability issues to the degree that they would if it was their own truck. And we saw, it was 10 years ago, perhaps, when that Walmart driver, it was the comedian, I can't think of the name of it. The black comedian.
Tyler Perry.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, who was it?
Tyler Perry, I think.
Yes. No, it wasn't Tyler Perry. It was
no.
Gosh, can't think of it. I can picture him. I can't think of his name.
I'm anyway, the same way. I know who you're talking about. So.
He, a Walmart driver put him in the hospital for a couple of months, and this was, obviously he was going to a show, and he was at risk of. I think that lawsuit ended up settling, but the problem is that companies like Walmart have obviously a giant target on their back, and anyone who knows anything about trucking knows that trucking companies are subject to these really substantial nuclear lawsuits, and so it's easier for a Walmart or an Amazon to sort of outsource that responsibility and that liability to an outsourced carrier. It shifts the liability away from the corporate parent into a for-hire or to a dedicated operator. And that, I think, is a trend that will continue because I don't think a lot of companies want the responsibility of having an in-house fleet, but they want the luxury of having the capacity that comes along with it.
Yes, and the expensive maintenance, maintenance and insurance, which a lot of people do not recognize, is off the charts now, especially insurance. And I think that's something we can talk about later in the program. By the way, it's Tracy Morgan, thanks to GBR. Yeah, one of our guys, one of our members of our team told me that, and I was like, oh, yeah, okay. Do you think that the outlook?
You're going to be shamed on social media for not doing that. So,
well, I get shamed on social media all the time, so it doesn't really bother me. I mean, at least I don't write for Transport Topics,
or work for the ATA.
People work there. That's interesting. That'd be a new concept for them. I thought they just went to cocktail parties. Yeah, I've had a few. My days of experience with them was back in the early '90s, and no, thank you.
So you're going to their events as a kid. It was, it was
great.
Boondoggle. It was great.
Yeah, Vegas was awesome.
They put on great boondoggles, and and I think that's part of it. It's a social club for truckers.
Yeah,
and
for trucking management,
trucking executives. You can go there. I mean, the audience go to a logistics. We host events at FreightWaves, and the typical sort of person that goes to our events are in their 30s or 40s or middle, they may be executive managers running a tech company, but typically running a much younger company. You go to the ATA events and the typical audience there are, in their 60 plus and older. This is an old boys club, if you will.
Absolutely. So that brings me to the small carrier dilemma. If you're a small carrier, and let's face it, you and I have dealt with them all of our lives. It's the small carrier with 10 trucks that hauls tomatoes out of Florida or fresh vegetables out of California, et cetera. Do you see that starting to fade into the sunset just because of the expense structure being built into the transportation industry, especially the punitive insurance rates, which I believe part of that is the unmitigated disaster of illegal CDLs and drivers who have no business being on the road, creating a higher risk profile for the industry?
No, I would say I do not see the independent operators going away. In fact, the data suggests the opposite. Now, this is what ATA would have you believe, is they would have you believe that the market's consolidating. And growing up in a trucking family in a large, if there is such thing as big trucking, people talk about big oil. I grew up in big trucking. My father started a business that became, the 5th largest truckload carrier in the U.S. It was big trucking my whole life, and that was a lot of what I was taught. And I love my father. I have an enormous amount of respect for him, and he's, in many ways, I idolize him as a person because I think he's a fantastic entrepreneur and a wonderful dad, a great mentor to me. But a lot of what I learned was the sort of narrative that was being taught or talked about among the ATA membership, which I don't think they ever challenged or questioned, which is this idea of a perpetual driver shortage. And the idea that because what happens is these trucking companies, these big trucking companies, end up with periodic and sometimes episodic shortages where they don't simply have enough truck drivers to fill the amount of trucks that they have. So they may have a shortage, and truck driver shortages happen all the time in the industry with individual carriers. And what the ATA has done is translated that into a market-wide shortage, ignoring the growth is all the small and independent carriers. And you can go back and look at the data in this, and we have it on Sonar, and this is the data. This is actually what caused the dispute or the public fight with where Chris Spear, the president of the ATA, came out against me personally and attacked me personally on Facebook, which I find actually quite hilarious that he spends his time on the weekends going through driver forums. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I do it myself, but this is a guy that's supposed to be like a dignified steward of the industry that's spending his time in Facebook forums shit posting about people he doesn't like. Probably not a good look for him. But anyways, he's doing it to me. And the whole thing that really, I think, riled him up was the fact that ATA is losing relevance because they represent the larger carriers. And the reason that they do that is that they represent them on a lot of issues. Some of these issues are issues that everyone should care about, which are things like safety. But many of those issues are things that, frankly, are built to favor a certain class of motor carrier, not favoring the smallest players in the market. I mean, if you truthfully looked at a lot of the safety regulations that the ATA has supported, a lot of those regulations are certainly under the guise of safety, but many of those same regulations are built to make the market less competitive and to try to stifle a lot of the growth of the small carriers. But it's not working for the ATA, despite their best efforts to restrict the amount of participants in the market, the amount of companies. The market is getting, as the market grows, the size of the carriers are smaller and smaller. And this trend is really, it's a linear growth curve all the way. Like the growth of the smallest carriers are consistently growing at a much higher rate than the largest carriers. In fact, you could argue that, I think the number, I don't have it right in front of me, but it's around 30% of the capacity, like larger trucking companies in terms of total trucks represented since 2009 have only grown by like 30%. So they've only grown their entire fleet base by 30%. And that's the JB Hunts and the Knights and the US Expresses and the Warners. But if you look at the smallest carriers, and again, I'm quoting off memory, so my number is not going to be precise here, but it's like 270% growth of the smallest carriers. So what's happening is the market is continuing to fragment. And I heard growing up that we would see consolidation, that the big industry, the big truckers are going to consolidate like the airlines or like the railroads or even like the banks have done in many cases. That's not what's happening. The market is fragmenting, and it's being caused by the proliferation of freight brokerage. And that's what is actually enabling the industry to really be fueled and the industry to grow much smaller on a per unit basis, because freight brokers have really solved the problem of finding freight for the smallest players. I mean, in the old days, the reason that the large carriers had the advantage, and my father used to say this all the time, is it isn't the procurement processes. It isn't the significant savings they get as a big company. And, in the 90s, there was a lot of consolidation. US Express was very acquisitive. A lot of the truckers were very acquisitive. And the theory held, because this was in the 90s, long haul trucking was, 10, 15 years old at post deregulation. There was a theory that these economies of scale would happen as these companies got bigger. They would benefit from much better procurement. And what they realized is when they got to about 100 trucks and maybe even 200 trucks, there's a lot of the advantages that you had by being big went away. Like it just flatlined. There was very little. You would get your trucks are supplied by 4 OEMs. Those OEMs don't have a ton of incentives to throw significant discounts out on trucks. There is some savings, but it's the delta from a 200 truck operator to 1,000 truck operator. It's very small. The fuel vendors may give you a penny or 2 gallon cheaper when you go from, say, 200 trucks to 1,000 trucks. But from 1,000 to 5,000 is pretty much the same thing. And insurance rates and all this stuff. But what happens is you get bigger, you still have to have truck drivers. And as your business becomes bigger, it becomes more complicated. It's harder to create relationships with those truck drivers. And then the model falls apart. And so what's happening is the bigger companies have struggled because they don't have the advantages of the technology. In fact, because they have all these old systems, they're not able to take advantage of some of the latest technology that's out there. That smaller companies are winning, and the barriers to entry just are gone away. And so what's happening is that because the freight brokers have in many ways more advanced technology than even the largest carriers do, they're able to supply freight for the smallest players at the detriment to the largest companies in the space. And that is exactly what's happening. And that's why the smaller companies are proliferating at a much faster rate. They're growing like bunnies, if you will, like replicating like bunnies. And the bigger companies are more growing like humans, like the very slow, podgy growth versus the smallest companies are just rapidly expanding. And that trend, I don't see anything that will disrupt that.
I think you nailed it, because as you said, basically what you're saying is size decreases innovation, and becoming a legacy carrier is like a Microsoft. There's a limit to how much you can expand your revenues, et cetera, without incurring greater costs. So you've nailed it right on the head. Real quick, for Craig over at the ATA, I'm not picking on you anymore after this. I'm in my 60s and I'm too young for Facebook. You might want to seek an alternative medium. Okay.
You're talking to Chris Spirit. I don't think I've been in Facebook, and I do have a Facebook account because some of our corporate freightway stuff is doing.
Right.
And I might log in once a month.
There you go.
I don't log into LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn maybe once a week.
Oh,
people send me messages, and like people on X reach out, DM, like, hey, I sent you a message on LinkedIn. I'm like, why didn't you just send me a message on X? It forces me to log in, which I really don't want to do, into LinkedIn. So anyways.
Yeah, LinkedIn is a bane of my existence. Let's move on, because you've nailed a great point, because I think the theory was in the 90s through the early 2000s and up to 2015 was for the larger carriers to acquire every division they have, to have a tanker division, a flatbed division, a lowboy division, et cetera, and try and make it all work. Well, you can't make this mishmash work. And going to one of my favorite subjects that you and I have been going back and forth with over the year, FedEx Freight's about to spin off. Now, having some relations with the old Watkins people, that tells you my background and age. Yeah, Buzz does have a nice place. I will say that, or he did, I should say. Their spinoff is facing some serious challenges in this economy. Now, like you said, the driver shortage is a myth. However, for the larger carriers, you could have anywhere from 6 to 8% of your fleet grounded due to that. And usually it's regionalized, in my opinion, from what I've observed. When you see a large carrier like that come into existence on its own without the money of a FedEx behind it, is it time for them to analyze their footprint and reduce some of their terminals? They're spread all over God's green earth. They're very thin, but at the same time, they still have to keep that presence in Mexico and Canada to be viable as an LTL carrier to the future. What do you see for FedEx Freight? Just your opinion, because we have no inside baseball knowledge of the path they're going to take, as how they're going to sit there and jump into a pretty saturated market at this point in time.
Well, I think it's important to be, and again, and I know you know this, John, but perhaps some of the listeners may not be aware of it. It's a big difference between LTL and truckload. Like the LTL business is a less than truckload. It's everything from a box, typically not, but it could be a box, to a pallet. And that's usually sort of the currency of LTL is in weight or dimensional weight is how they sort of think of it. Where you're paying on a per pound basis, it's dimensionalized versus what you're paying on a truckload to buy the whole truck. And I've moved a box of, airbags that's 30 pounds on a full truckload, a 53-foot trailer, which could support 45,000 pounds because of some service requirements versus LTL, which would normally, parcel would probably even take that shipment. But anyways, there's a very big difference between the LTL dynamics and the truckload dynamics. There are economies of scale. It is a fixed cost. LTL largely has a lot of operating leverage because of its fixed cost nature. Is that ultimately I'm trying to drive as much volume into this sort of fixed network as possible. sort of a good analogy for those that may not be know a ton about trucking is the LTL business looks more like the airline industry, where I'm selling on a per seat basis versus a charter flight where I'm selling the whole airplane. So in the LTL basis, I'm trying to fill up that truckload with a single set of shipments, maybe a pallet or 2 or 5 pallets. Whereas in truckload, I'm basically taking up a full truck. And so there are economies of scale, and there are benefits of having a national network that you would never see in truckload. And the reason is that the fixed infrastructure, the network of hubs and spokes inside of an LTL network, these cross docks that are across the country, provide the sort of create a lot of operating leverage as volume enters the network. And so there isn't, from what I could tell, a ton of, could they shrink the size of some of their facilities? Could they consolidate facilities? Yeah, absolutely. But I don't think that is the advantage that FedEx would pick up. I think its advantage, frankly, is in having an operating team that is focused specifically on operating what's best for FedEx Freight and not trying to sort of navigate the FedEx organization to be profitable. And we've seen this, UPS had overnight, arguably that wasn't a great transaction for them. They overnight was an LTL business, now called UPS, but now it's part of Transforce. It was called UPS Freight. Now it's been sold to TFI. It didn't work well inside of UPS. And the same thing you could say about FedEx Freight is it's not working well inside of FedEx because you can look at performance of Old Dominion or even XPO and see how much better those companies operate than what they work inside of companies like FedEx and UPS. And look, FedEx and UPS has got their hands full with their own businesses. Like the parcel world is a challenging business with Amazon entering the market, with pressure from the U.S. Postal Service entering the market. But it has a lot of sort of advantages because these are closed loops. There's not a lot of competition. It truly has economies of scale and is sort of an oligopoly business model. LTL has some of those constructs, at least in terms of operational leverage versus truckload. But I think it will be a better business either sold and consolidated or operated as a standalone entity.
100% agree. I think they really need to start looking also at possibly following part of or integrating ideas from the XPO model. XPO is head and shoulders ahead of a lot of other LTL carriers, in my opinion, with their model. And so is Old Dominion. But Old Dominion specializes, as you say, in being Old Dominion. They're a lot like the old Watkins that I used to work with. When you sit there and focus on what XPO is doing, that's a good model. Integrated logistics, consolidation, et cetera. And a lot of customers, especially manufacturers, appreciate having a dedicated consolidator to sit there, bring all of their shipments into a break bulk, deliver 3-4 truckloads a day into their facility. And that's storage that they don't have to allocate in their own manufacturing facility. It has some advantages, and I agree with you 100%.
But
yeah, go ahead.
There is one thing to keep in mind. And I think what UPS learned and what FedEx has also learned is that the person that's driving the volume to the parcel network is often not the same decision maker as the person that's driving the volume into the LTL truckload networks. And I think what has happened is this theory that, and I would say Fred Smith probably deserves credit for sort of this, his vision was he wanted to be everything logistics of all modes of traffic. Interesting enough, FedEx nor UPS ever bought a truckload operator, although UPS bought Coyote. And what I think they learned in these experiments, both FedEx and UPS have learned, is that the salespeople that represent the FedEx brand, the parcel salespeople, these are typically people calling on either small businesses or calling on national accounts, selling parcel, which is boxes that come to your offices or come to your house. A lot of it now is e-commerce. Those people cannot wrap their head around how to sell LTL or truckload. Truckload we'll put aside for a second, but LTL specifically. And I think what they've learned is that the advantage of having all these sort of national accounts actually is a detriment to their core business, which is parcel, because and this is also the detriment to their LTL business, because if I'm moving an enormous amount of parcel and e-commerce business through your network, then I may want some significant price concessions that on the LTL side that may not work for the LTL operator, and vice versa. And I think that's what they learned is that just the benefits that they thought existed just don't. And it's largely to do with because e-commerce has changed these business models so substantially that the idea of having a single decision maker that does both parcel, LTL, and perhaps freight brokerage just hasn't played out.
Well, real quick, take a quick break here. MacroEdge.net/ozone, MacroEdge.net/ozone. Get your 2-week free trial there. And folks, FreightWaves.com. Don't go a day without reviewing that. You not only get stories about trucking and transportation, you get logistics, rail, and more, which brings me to rail. And I think, Craig, this is a great time to just roll right into that with everything we've been talking about. What do you make of the rumored report this week of Union Pacific looking at Norfolk Southern? I think that would be massive shift for the industry and possibly modernize our east-west rail system tremendously. Please. I love rail mergers. It's like we're going back to 1894.
I love the railroads. I mean, I own trains.com and really sort of, I love the railroads. I've always loved the railroads, but certainly through our acquisition of Comback and Trains, even more so. It's interesting. I'm writing a book. I'm published. It's going to come out in October. And I spent a lot of time on the railroads, and I did a lot of work on the KC sort of battle between the Canadians, the CP and CN. And it's interesting because I think you could argue that the railroad mergers have not really benefited anybody except for the shareholders of the railroads and maybe management. And from what I can tell, yes, there is the argument that you get one seamless network from Kansas City and CN to CP down to Mexico. And I think that's a fair argument. But if you look at the railroads themselves, the service quality significantly deteriorated because of it. They do benefit the shareholders of these companies substantially, but the other constituents that are impacted just aren't winners in this. These are the shippers. These people rely upon the railroads. They have been negatively impacted from pricing, a lot of pricing power that the railroads pick up because now they don't have competition. You get seamless networks. And so I would say it's hard for me to believe that the broader public necessarily benefits from railroad mergers to the degree that the shareholders of the railroads do. And I'm not judging it. It's a market commentary is that the less competition we have in the rail industry, just frankly, the more pricing power these guys have and the more service flexibility they have. In other words, service is likely to deteriorate. And I don't see the case that you could make that having more railroad mergers changes that theory. Now, look, I'm a free market capitalist and believe that companies should be able to pursue what's in their best interest for their shareholders, and ultimately it'll be up to the administration to decide how they want to deal with that. I think that's all to be sort of said. It's interesting. This administration's fairly predictable, but also when it comes to certain industries, they have sort of surprised us. So I think we'll see. It strikes me that the FTC and the STB would probably be supportive, but who knows, right?
It's a strange combination only because there has been a need to tie East and West Coast together. I mean, BNSF basically has the northern half of the United States locked up, yet their service quality is still dicey in many areas. You look at what's happening in Chicago and you get great service in, terrible service out. CSX, BNSF, it doesn't matter. It's a very weird situation where they want to be competitive intermodal, and folks, I'm not making this up. They can lose a 53-foot trailer that's supposed to go to Miami and it ends up in Memphis or Dallas. It's no difference than a box.
They wouldn't know it for 6 months. Trust me. I know.
Correct.
Personal. We did some disaster relief. This was 2005, and we did a lot of work for FEMA. And there was all of a sudden, like 7 months later, these 2 trailers out of nowhere show up with bottled water. And they're like, hey, we found these trailers. And they had been on the railroad. They had gone TOFC, which is trailer on flat car. It's different than containerized freight. You put them on a trailer. And I remember thinking, oh my God, like, what do we do? Who do we call for this? It is like, go donate the water to someone because I don't even know what to do with it. But that was because they got lost on the rail, and then railroads don't know. I mean, the railroads are an amazing business model. And I think it's like, in fact, one of the crazy stats I discovered as I was doing this book was that the railroads make more profit than even Microsoft. Like the profitability of some of the largest railroads like UP generated more profit than Microsoft did 3 years ago. So, I mean, these are immensely profitable businesses, especially for transportation asset businesses. They're immensely profitable, and they have an enormous amount of market control over pricing with not a ton of competition. And I just don't know that is necessarily going to benefit shippers if there's more consolidation.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting turnout. I'm going to be curious to see what the administration reaction is. And so that brings us to the next administration thing, because you and I seem to have some synergies in agreeing that this tariff war wasn't exactly the best executed concept in the world of capitalism. Oh, I am. I'm being polite. Believe me, I could rant.
You don't want to Chris social post.
I could rant some obscenities about this, the way it's been handled. I mean, there's a time and place for this, but the way it has been handled is basically worse than the 1976 Buccaneers. That's another subject.
It is so. The problem is that if there was a single policy, if the Trump administration said we're going to put blanket tariffs of 10% and we're going to do 55, like make up a number, 55% on China, and this is what we're going to do, and it's not up for negotiation, this is what you get, then businesses would immediately say, okay, we got to price this stuff in, we got to deal with it. Like, of course it's always up for negotiation, right? Like naturally they could have come out and said, we're going to do 10% blankets, and these countries are going to have 35%, this country's going to have 55%. Hell, this country is going to have 100%. Hopefully it wasn't China in that case, but they did do 145. Anyways, if they had come out with some consistent guidance and said, these are the plans, and there is no room for negotiation, I think the economy would have helped to achieve their goals and drive their goals forward better, because companies would say there is certainty out here. We are absolutely certain that there's going to be 55% tariffs on China and 10% blanket tariffs. So whatever the numbers are, make them up. It doesn't matter. The lack of certainty and the yo-yoing that has gone on and the roller coaster, you could even argue the taco thing, the taco trade doesn't work necessarily for decision makers. It is frozen investment and certainty in the economy. And you can see it in the goods economy, is that the goods economy, which is the world that I track, has been significantly stunted, not for lack of sort of activity, but lack of confidence. And it certainly has lowered activity through the lack of confidence. But my point is that if the administration would just stop and say, these are the tariffs, and like my dad used to say, this is the rule, deal with it, there's no negotiation. And I knew that there was no negotiation. The moment you open up, I'm willing to talk about something and willing to negotiate it, and there's no certainty, the moment doubt creeps in. And I think the administration, if they just said, these are the rules, there's no negotiation, you're not getting out of this, you're in trouble, this is the way it is, just like my dad used to say, there is no negotiation, I think we would all been better off. And that's not what's happened. It's this constant change in policy and direction, and we are going to negotiate it, and it's got to be by this date. It's just like, just come out with a set of rules that we all know and we'll all live with them. And that's not what we got. And that's what I think has been the disaster. Hasn't been the tariffs themselves. I think it's the inconsistency around the tariffs has been the disaster.
I think that the worst place in the world to be, if we finally get away from the taco trade, would be the LAX Long Beach Port Terminal, trying to get a container out of there on August 11th, because on August 12th at midnight, it gets ugly really quick.
Yeah, I mean, this is like all this uncertainty, right? Like, we don't know whether or not the administration is going to change, like what's going to change, when it's going to change, how it's going to change. There's still, we have a China framework, but we haven't seen the actual. There's been a lot of media reports about what's in it, but it hasn't been official. It's just a lot of so much uncertainty, and I think that's what's causing a lot of businesses to just pull back on investment, because they don't know when things are gonna change. And I think that is the biggest issue we've got right now.
Yeah, that's why I shut down mine, because I was asked to eat the margins, and I told my customers I'm not going to work for 1%. Here, good luck contacting my vendors, and you deal with it yourselves. And they found out real quick that Chinese the tariffs on Chinese products on steel and aluminum did go into effect, and it had a great impact on their margins. So it's a lesson they're going to learn the hard way. Let's go on to something that's your pet project. You had mentioned this in your feed, and it's got everybody curious about a new freight tech project. Now, I'm hoping this is a real-time data system for everyone who's subscribes to it could use in their daily decisions in managing logistics and trucking. But why don't you fill everybody in and let us know what you're working on to the extent that you can without giving away too many secrets.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think I'm generally talking about our Sonar platform I'm talking about just the activity. If you're talking specifically about what I teased last night,
that's what I was talking about. Yes.
Yeah. So look, I think we've got some big announcements coming up on the Sonar side. And I'd say it's twofold. One is it's some really great productization of our data. It's expansion of our data, but we're rolling out. And I was talking to our head of media yesterday on our content side, and she was telling me that the Sonar team, it's our data product, has so many releases, like news announcements, and they're all really good. These aren't small, like tedious things or transactional things. But they're really some solid announcements. She's like, there's so many, I don't even know how to like I'm having problems putting these in, sequencing them. And because they're coming fast and furious. And I think what we're seeing is this really interesting development happen in freight tech, which is if you sort of look at the evolution of venture capital, sort of version 1 of venture capital investing in freight tech was 2015. Companies like Convoy was sort of like Gen 1, Flexport was that Gen 1, Project 44. And things started to really cool off in 22 to really earlier this year, is that there wasn't a lot of new investments made. Couple outliers that have been in there, but certainly it was an exception to the rule. And the market and supply chain and freight really cooled significantly of investment. And I think it's AI. It's also companies are realizing that this sort of geopolitical structure is permanently changing. Like the idea of us going back to friendly, consistent, no tariff relations with China, where trade is a backdrop, and we let our markets available for Chinese goods, but they won't do the same. That's forever gone. And the trade, whether it's the administration that's currently in the White House, a future Republican administration, a Democrat administration, or anywhere in between that, trade is going to be the front lines for any geopolitical conflict. So we're in a second Cold War, my theory, and supply chains at the front lines. And so I think this is changing the calculation for a lot of businesses, and they're having to sort of think about this. And this is creating a really nice window for things like AI and AI investing and venture investing to sort of pour capital. Plus, we've seen a lot of M&A activity happening in the logistics sector for freight tech businesses that are getting purchased. And in doing so, I think that is freeing up both human capital that's reentering the market, but it's also giving some of the venture investors certainty that there's an exit. Because for many years, they were pouring billions of dollars in VC money, but there was no exits to count. And I think we're starting to see that. Both DAT and Triumph have been active in the market. Triumph is a bank that serves the industry. I think their track record is different than, say, DAT's track record, only because Triumph is a new participant in sort of technology investing, whereas DAT is a part of Roper, who is probably one of the most successful investors in technology businesses in history, sort of a Berkshire Hathaway of SaaS. And I think I think because of that, we have both new entrants and a large consolidator investing in the space. I think it's creating a new wave of interest. And so many new startups are starting in the space. It's a really exciting time. It really is. And I think this sort of reminds me of 2018 when Freightways had sort of 2 years into it, and there was just so much activity happening. That's what it reminds me of right now.
Well, Craig, I'm hoping one thing from this AI boom, because one thing that people don't understand about AI is it's very impersonal. It's all data. I think the biggest problem is
it's all context. So
yeah, I think people though miss the big thing when managing a fleet of human drivers is, and it was one of the requirements for my fleet, that every fleet manager, including myself, had to go out, meet the drivers, get to know them, not just say hi on the phone or type crap on a Qualcomm terminal. That doesn't work. And I think the lack of interpersonal management skills is going to hamper this generation. They're going to use the technology as a crutch, and we need to have some training. I guess I'm writing my own job opportunity as a late in life consultant, to go out and tell people how to communicate with the driving community and interact like a human being and not a damn machine.
But John, that is the reason that the larger carriers don't have much of a future in terms of market share growth. Now they can move into dedicated, certainly intermodal and sort of third party logistics, but the larger carriers don't have the advantage. It's all market driven. This is all a situation. Dr. Dre, who's I think is a self-described communist who's listening to us. And I love him. He's a very hard union guy. Just like the comment that the mega carriers are losing power. But this all goes back to the fact that when you lose the relationship with the individual driver and you rely upon technology, you're never going to be able to beat the guy who has the independent has the ability to manage their own life. And I think that's the reason that we continue to see the proliferation and growth of small operators, and we'll continue to see the larger carriers struggle. And that is at the detriment to the organizations like ATA. And this isn't just about ATA. I want to be very clear. US Express was one of the most profitable long-haul trucking companies in the 90s. So was Covenant, so was CFI, so was Celadon. And what they had in common is they were all long-haul operators, and they benefited from these big economies of scale and keeping their drivers running, nonstop essentially through their team operations. And what's happened is the invention of brokerage, or the proliferation of brokerage and intermodal, has wiped that out. And now what we're seeing is the technologies that have come about. This AI is sort of the next phase of that that's coming about, that will further erode the advantages that the large carriers have. And so their refuge, and I think Covenant Logistics has done a fantastic job of this, probably better than anybody, of pivoting away from the over-the-road trucking business into these weird bespoke niches like chicken hauling and managed warehouses and military ammunition hauling, where they're less commoditized. And I think that's the future for some of the larger truckload carriers, is they've got to sort of pivot. J.B. Hunt has done a fantastic job of moving into intermodal and sort of owning that. But the idea that these larger mega fleets are going to continue to be the lion's share of the capacity or grow and consolidate just isn't there. What we're going to see is AI is going to be a bigger technology. And I think in many ways it will further fragment the market, because now with AI, if I'm a truck driver, I could have an AI agent working on my behalf, finding me freight and essentially dispatching me out, that I don't need to use even an app to log into. And I think that's where that ends up. It's just going to fragment the independent operator. The independent operator has the greatest opportunities because there are no barriers to entry in trucking, and shippers, big shippers, because this was this sort of saving grace for the larger carriers, up to about 5 years ago, were not willing to take the predominance of their freight to the freight brokerage industry. They wanted to keep it to their national the large core carrier groups. And in doing so, that prevented a lot of the really higher paying freight to end up in the small guys. But this is where I think Convoy and Uber and C.H. Robinson, Navisphere and Echo, et cetera, they were able to sort of prove to shippers that they were able to handle the service quality and expectations, perhaps even better than some of the larger asset carriers. And that is why that value system for the larger carriers has gone away. And that's frankly why the ATA's real power over this industry, or able to influence the way this industry operates, will continue to erode, because they don't represent the small carriers. They represent the big carriers. The big carriers are losing market share as a percent. And this is well known in data, regardless of what the ATA pretends.
That's my whole point. The lack of an interpersonal relationship. Great. My AI can sit there and say, it's like the old load matching software. Driver X has number of hours available. We need to reposition him here, assigning this load. But only the fleet manager or dispatcher, or whatever terminology you wish to use, knows where that driver needs to be in 7 days to see his family. And that's why I think the AI is going to have to pick its game up to really meet the efficiencies of the human interaction on top of the company's needs. It gets tricky. I'm not going to argue that.
Think about this from the perspective of a driver. So if I'm a driver and I can go get an independent truck and I can be my own boss, truly have my own boss, why would I go into a forced dispatch operation. And that is the big delta. The decision is if the relationship with the company's not personal anyways. And I've been a fleet manager. I managed a board of drivers when I was a teenager of 30 truck drivers, and I managed night operations, which were 500. I've served that role. Like, it is not, there are individual relationships that are there, but it's a very impersonal business at the end of the day, because as a driver manager, your job is to get the driver to do the things that you need to do to successfully deliver freight. You're there to help them if there's problems, but ultimately your job when you show up at the day is to make sure freight gets from point A to point B. And that's in a forced dispatch operation, which all the big carriers sort of operate under forced dispatch, is it forces the driver to do things. That's why they call it forced dispatch. But if the technology layers and the systems that are being created today and have been created the last couple of years will allow the driver to have more voice in what they do and have more control, and AI as a technology sorts to create these agents that go out and find freight on my behalf as a truck driver and negotiate perhaps on my behalf, then I have far more control over my work schedule, over my life, and perhaps over my economics, that I end up winning. And I think that's where that heads, is I think the freight brokers are going to continue to win. And I know there's people on this call who think freight brokers are evil and out to get them and manipulating and controlling the market. It's all ridiculous stuff, but I do think they end up becoming winners. And look, as someone who grew up in big trucking, it makes me sad. It makes me sad to see some of these big carriers that that have gone away and sort of fallen on hard times. It's a sad thing. There's a lot of history in these businesses. But the same token, that's where it's headed, and the big carrier is just going to continue to lose out.
Yes. Well, I'll just close it with this. I do miss the Roadrunner 66, but let's get to the most important subject of the day. Firecrown Media, your media empire, where you have saved Flying Magazine. Now, for those of you who don't know, I had an origin with my father, who worked on P-51 Mustangs in the 60s and 70s. And sitting on the wing of a plane reading a Flying Magazine was the highlight of my childhood. Tell us, what other plans do you have? And tell us more about how you rescued these people in the less than 5 minutes we have remaining, because you did a great service going after some of these legacy magazines and converting them to the digital world and making them viable again. I think I commend you for that 100 times over.
These are, magazines are a piece of art in some ways, particularly these legacy magazines. And look, because of the technology innovations around media and business models, and you can really blame Google and Facebook and even X as sort of taking wallet share, advertising dollars away from a lot of these print legacy operators, and the fact that a lot of these traditional media operators did not pivot their business models fast enough to sort of adapt, gave me the opportunity to go buy these things fairly cheaply, a couple times EBIT, and essentially make some investments in those magazines to sort of, modernize them and also preserve them. And I'm sort of a glutton for punishment. I moved from one difficult industry, trucking, to another one, which is print media. But it has been a fun project in the sense that there's so much history. One of the magazines we bought is like the trains.com, and I happen to own one of the largest transportation libraries and like of total number of artifacts. I think we actually own, I want to say that the largest artifacts of historical transportation images in the world. And I think we have more than Smithsonian, but I can't confirm that. I tried to figure that out, but we're one or two in terms of total artifacts of old print images, just documents and stuff. And what's amazing about that is there's so much history in transportation. What I love about transportation, and this is one of the reasons I love the print side, is because it like Flying Magazine has been around since 1927, and it sort of is an enthusiast magazine, but it's also an aspirational magazine, sort of covering. 1927 was Ziff Davis, the guy that founded Flying, found it because he was inspired by Charles Lindbergh's voyage across the ocean. Like, this is the history of aviation is in Flying Magazine's history. And then the railroad magazines, the history of the entire American expansion into the West and American exceptionalism and capitalism is all tied to the expansion of the railroads. And And freight waves is about what's happening real time. And that's why I love transportation, and the chance that we have to buy these print magazines is much about the passion of being connected to an industry, which I love so much, and the affiliation with so much periods of history. And the idea that we could preserve these things for another generation just makes it super, super cool.
Sir, I appreciate that. If you would please, I don't want to abuse our time with you. I appreciate the hour. When you get your book out, please come back on MacroEdge Radio. We would love to interview you and promote your book.
Well, we'll be sure to do it. This one's really a sort of a spectrum of all the major stuff that we're excited to talk about. And I do talk about, for my friends at ATU, about the ELP mandate and the truck driver shortage and the proliferation of non-domiciled CDLs. So I know that some of the audience that's tuning in today will appreciate that. But a lot of it is about the history of how all this stuff came about. Because one of the things that I get asked constantly by people who join the industry is like, where do they learn about the history of it? Where do they learn about transportation and trucking and logistics and supply chains? It's not a textbook. Frankly, there aren't a lot of books out there. And I'm hoping to just give my perspective on the history of it, and provide some guidance for people who want to understand the context of how we got here.
I look forward to reading that. And if you find some way to squeeze in the chapter, here's the cure for the Tennessee Department of Transportation, I'll buy 100 copies and give it out at the truck stop. That's how I know my drivers. Even the ones that are older than me and retired, they say, give me a copy. That is the bane of America's existence, that state. Sir, I wish to thank you for your time. Please plug FreightWaves one more time. And thank you for your time on MacroEdge Radio.
I appreciate you having me, John. So freightwaves.com is our media site. I'm at Freight Alley. So anything, whether you're just trying to learn about a topic in supply chain or freight, or want to ask a question, feel free to reach out on X. I don't bother with LinkedIn. Your chances are you'll never get a response on LinkedIn, but I do respond to 95% of the messages on X.
Craig, thank you once again. And folks, macroedge.net/ozone, macroedge.net/ozone, 2-week free trial. Check it out. Next week, I think we might have some tariff news to talk about as we head into August, and also the craziness we're seeing in our markets. For MacroEdge Radio, this is John Galt. Good night now.